All right, welcome back to the show, Basil.
Thank you so much for having me again. I appreciate it.
Well, you're back by popular demand because people were really fascinated by our previous discussion about media market literacy. And one of the perspectives I think that you bring that's unique is the fact that you come from a more hard left milieu, at least like a more class-based milieu. And one thing that I've noticed over the years of watching the left, especially the Bernie left from afar, is their aversion to certain cultural issues where they'll say, for example, of the issue of like transgenderism, that it's culture war fluff
Mm-hmm.
and that it's a distraction built to divide, blah, blah, blah. You've argued to the contrary that it isn't distraction. So let's just start with this. What is the trans question, if you will, under your framework?
Yeah,
Politics.
I mean, you're right. What the left does whenever the trans issue comes up is that they try to like obfuscate it by saying this is a culture war distraction. This is a niche topic. It's only whatever percent of the population. Why are you so obsessed? Why do you care? You're weird for caring, this type of thing. But I think it's important to remember that this is complete. It's a complete, that line of argumentation is itself a distraction from the fact that it is very much based in like the law, class, money, the state and its power to effectuate itself on you. So the trans question, really what it is it's a question of censorship, right? So the trans question is all of these things that we talk about, that people talk about, the bathrooms, the sports, the men and women's prisons. All of those things are downstream effects of incorporating what's called gender identity and expression into the Civil Rights Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Civil Rights Act, what we have to understand is the Civil Rights Act is not some benevolent piece of legislation meant to uplift people. What it is, it's a piece of legislation meant to censor the discourse, censor people, and further erode freedom of association, right? So you can't fire someone if they can claim a protected class. You can fire someone if they claim a protected class, of course, but they have, this kind of ace up their sleeve of being able to perhaps rely on the Civil Rights Act to say that you are firing them based off of a protected characteristic, right? In the same way, and how this works and for censorship is that every university, every place of work that has an HR department has to have some sort of, has to conform itself to Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? So the HR department is making sure that the employer stays within those legal bounds. So every expansion of the Civil Rights Act beyond just like first, descendants of African slaves to all people with a racial identity, to women, then to gays, and then to cross-dressers, is an expansion of that kind of censorship bureaucracy, right? And also, like the other side of that coin is that it's an expansion of the kind of patronage system, right? It creates these blocks of people who can access those kinds of legal privileges to say you can't fire me, that you have to hire me, all of these other types of things. And the reason why, to kind of put a pin on it is to say it is not culture war when we say you can get fired from your job because you take issue with a man using the woman's restroom. It's not culture war.
No, that's economic at that point.
Yeah, it's pure economics to say that we're going to put men in women's prisons, or working people who rely on public schools to watch their children as they work for the public schools because of the Civil Rights Act, then having to teach your children that some people can be born in the wrong body, up to and including them. And if God forbid your child believes this about themselves, if you don't affirm that false premise, the state can then take your children away, which we've seen in Texas, we've seen in Washington State, we've seen in Canada. So it's the idea that it's not a bread and butter class issue is absolute obfuscation. And the reason why they do that obfuscation is because the TQ, and this is why it's a litmus test, is completely inextricable from the left project, right? You could actually make arguments about immigration, you can make arguments about race, you can make arguments, but no person who considers themselves part of the Democratic Party proper, or the more expansive idea of the left, including people who like say that they hate the left, like the DSA people, or people who call themselves communists, or people who call themselves socialists or anarchists or whatever. The TQ is a line that they cannot cross and still be within the fold. So it's an important litmus test where, as we see kind of people coming together from left and right, we're seeing a kind of rehash of that we saw in 2015. As we see people coming from the left, this is an important filter and litmus test for them, in the way that, in my opinion, the question of like Jewish supremacy and Jewish chauvinism is for people who come from the right.
One thing to note as well, even though this issue, the TQ, is cultural, when you're liable to getting fired for deviating on this issue in corporate America, it becomes an economic issue as well, because it increases managerial power, in the sense that now your manager can find another excuse to can you, and it just increases the power of those people. So it's not so easy to separate the cultural from the economic. It's very much intertwined, and by ceding ground on this, these so-called leftists that are talking about labor rights and checking the power of managers and their bosses, they're just not fighting this adequately. I've even, if I'm not mistaken, that you've even said too that those who dismiss the TQ are actually also hiding like material issues with regards to this question. What are those material issues? Are you referring to like pharmaceutical companies or other interests that want to maintain the status quo here?
Right. So if the left is basically a political coalition that's funded by the tech, defense, pharma, and finance industries, right? So it's the most obvious glaring one is like, yeah, you're creating a class of permanent customers for the pharmaceutical industry in terms of like hormones and surgeries and all that thing. Mm-hmm. But the Affordable Care Act also requires, another example, for health insurance providers to cover quote unquote gender affirming care. So elective surgery. So for a guy to get a tit job or a jaw shaving or a brow shaving or whatever. So that affects all of our premiums. That affects all of that. That's money being transferred from working people to this client class, right? Another example is in New York City. They recently had a thing where, they now have to have certain trans only homeless shelters. It's a disbursement of millions of dollars to a kind of NGO class of PMCs to manage and oversee these types of programs. So it's a jobs program for leftists with college degrees to kind of oversee disbursements from the state to kind of lump in proletariat elements of like, trans homeless people and hookers and whatever the case may be.
One thing that I could gather as well from what you said, because from what you're saying here is that the TQ, it has a party line discipline type of mechanism to it, where from your run-of-the-mill liberal down to your edgy leftist, it seems like this is used as a way to discipline people and get them in line. What are some of like the most notable examples of people like, say, like the post-left, like dissident left, or like harder leftist sects of them being disciplined for not being on the right side of the TQ?
I'm sure there are examples I could point to that are escaping me right now, but I know from my own personal experience of like going onto the internet in 2019-ish and using this as a litmus test, this was always something that kind of separated the wheat from the chaff. And it was like, so if you failed on this question, especially in times where it's amorphous, where people are coming together, those will always be the people who would then again side with, the left as like the left party structure more properly. But I also want to say that it's not something that's unique just to the left, right? Because we see similar things happening on the right. When we see like Riley Gaines and we see the LGBs without the T's and the homo cons and whatever, we're seeing or Blair White, we're seeing a kind of mutation of this. We're seeing a kind of new iteration of this where these people will at one thing that they'll do is they'll say, "Oh, we are against, the cringe transgenders, but we of course have to make an exception for the real transsexuals who are diagnosed with quote unquote gender dysphoria." And it's important to remember that the DSM-5 is not an arbiter of reality, right? Just because the DSM-5 categorizes something as one way does not make it so. Just because a person is very emotionally distraught over the fact that they are a man or a woman doesn't make them anything other than a man or a woman. So what we see on the right is kind of this it's actually a rehash of, I don't know if any of the listeners might know, like back in the Tumblr days, what was called the true scum argument, where you would be like real transsexuals who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria looking down their nose at trans trenders who wanted to kind of jump on the kind of cultural cachet of the early 2010s of like identifying as non-binary or trans or whatever. But then the second way that we see this is that we see people like Billboard Chris, like Riley Gaines, whatever, making exceptions for people like Blair White and Caitlyn Jenner by saying, "Oh, we don't care what adults do. We don't want them transing children." However, the left would be very happy to have some sort of compromise about you have to wait until you're 18 to chop your dick off, so long as in the Civil Rights Act, gender identity expression is still codified, because that's what the main purpose of all of this is that expansion of that censorship and patronage system. So they'll be like, all right, fine, we'll give you your little carve out so your kids can't get surgeries, so long as the cross-dresser at your office is able to become a kind of Democratic Party CCP agent within your office and kind of act as a kind of disciplinarian for the party line.
On the right, do you see more of the dynamic of the critique of criticize the critique of the excesses, but the reification of the original premises more so than the left?
I think so. I think because they're so desperate for a win, and there's such a misunderstanding of what the TQ is at heart. Because on the right, what we see is a lot of kind of infantile disgust, right? Where it's like, I'm a cosmopolitan. I don't care about how people dress or how people act or how people present themselves or who they fuck or whatever. That doesn't bother me. But on the right, we see a lot of this kind of infantile, knee-jerk disgust reaction. But in that knee-jerk disgust reaction that doesn't actually get to the root of the issue, we find this thing where it's like, well, if you pass, if you're fuckable, you get a pass, basically, right? And at the point, and it's I love that you are using Basilisms back at me, where it's
yes.
The whole critiquing the excesses and redefining the premises, right? So they're critiquing the excesses of men and women's sports or men in women's prisons or transing kids. These are extreme excesses, but the premise itself is whether the law will recognize gender identity expression, and very few of them are willing to really attack that. And the way that you attack that is say, we want to overturn the Supreme Court case Bostock, which read into Title VI and Title VII sexual orientations and gender identity as a form of sex discrimination, because Title VI and Title VII are about sex discrimination in the workplace. Right. So the Supreme Court said that discrimination based on a quote unquote sexual orientation or a gender identity is at root a type of sex based discrimination, because you're discriminating against, say, a male because he is presenting as a female. Right? You wouldn't discriminate against, it wouldn't be discrimination if you wouldn't fire a female for presenting as a female. You're only firing this male for presenting as a female. So they're reading into Title VI and Title VII cross-dressers, when really when it was passed, it was meant to say, you can't discriminate against women in the workplace. But now it's saying you can't discriminate against men who say they're women in the workplace, because that is in and of itself is a type of sex-based discrimination.
Correct me if I'm wrong here for this dynamic on the right. Wasn't there a controversy surrounding the TQ with the Times Square Passage Press crowd not too long ago? Isn't there something like that going on over there?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, I've been beating this drum since like 2019-ish, right? So I was really kind of became synonymous with making the case of the trans question as a litmus test, right? And that if you are anti-left, if you're opposed to the left, there's no reason for you to give it an inch, right? I'm not policing who you're friends with. I'm not policing who you sleep with. I'm not policing any of that stuff, right? But as we're selling our takes, as we're engaging in a politicized media market, there's no reason for us to even give an inch to the premises of, men can be women, real trans people exist, whatever the case may be. And 2 summers ago, or something like that, a year and a half ago, I think it was summer 2024. So in early 2024, Man's World, which is a magazine that is the editor-in-chief is Raw Egg Nationalist, and it was at one time published by Passage Press, which is run by Jonathan Keeperman Lomez, who now has a show on The Blaze with Chris Rufo of the Manhattan Institute. Passage Press having been sponsored by Teal at some point, they put out a issue of their magazine in which they covered a fashion designer by the name of Elena Velez's fashion show, right? And there's more connections there between Elena Velez and Urbit and, that whole thing we could get, but part of that included a full-page spread of Pariah the doll, this cross-dresser who became infamous in the certain Dimes Square scene. And really the funniest part is not many people know this. A little bit of backstory is that the reason that blew up, that magazine came out earlier in the year, and I remember that they did a kind of promotional video where they kind of flipped through it very quickly, and you could see that spread in it, but no one really noticed it. It was only that spring when Passage Press and IM 1776 had sponsored an event for Steve Saylor at Sovereign House, which is kind of like a venue in Manhattan. I went to that and I was kicked out of that event by Moldovan citizen who ran that venue for some time. And what happened was Pariah, in order to kind of flex on me, to be like, oh, you got kicked out, but I'm here in the magazine.
Why were you kicked out? Like,
so Moldovan citizen came up to me and was like, oh, you talk too much shit about Anna Kachian of Red Scare, which is at that time was really not true. I was very careful about my critique and being like, listen, the trans question goes this way, and being very polite. After that, I was a big old fucking bitch. I was like, you're an Armenian swamp witch. You've had 10 abortions. Like, you're a fucking cunt. But at that time, it was not true. But Moldovan citizen still kicked me out. And so Pariah, wanting to flex on me, was posted the spread of her. Wow. In the magazine to kind of be like, oh, you got kicked out. I'm here. I'm in the magazine. A big mistake, bitch. Big fucking mistake, because it causes kind of like nuclear bomb in the fucking discourse, because, many people took it in that kind of knee-jerk disgust reaction where it's like, ugh, a tranny in my magazine? What's going on? But it's like, no. We all know, because I've been here banging this drum, that there's no reason for you to include this in your magazine. So it begs the question of, why is this included in your magazine, right? And then you start digging deep and you're like, oh, because Passage Press sponsored that fashion show after they had met at an Urbit event in Portugal, right? So it starts drawing all of these transactional connections between, Passage Press, Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, Dimes Square, and it kind of collapsed the kayfabe that we had been putting up with, the kind of gaslighting that we had been putting up with for years, which was to say that, oh no, there's no connection between the BAP sphere and the Dimes Square scene. This kind of completely disabuses of that gaslighting, to be like, no, you guys are just different departments of the same corporation, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is just wild. What's happened to Passage Press since that? Because you alluded to how some of these people are now with Blaze. Is this just these guys just evolving to like the new media market? Like, what's going on there?
Well, Passage Press was bought out by the name escapes me. It's something like Foundation or Foundational or Founders or something like. It's not Founders Fund, but it's something along those lines. But they bought out Passage Press, they bought out Terror House, they bought out this other publishing thing. They bought a bunch of, like, basically, if you have over 1,000 subscribers on Substack, that kind of sphere was like looking to kind of pick you up because it wants to create a kind of media ecosystem for themselves, right? And so that's why when Jonathan Keeperman and Chris Rufo got picked up by the Blaze, it was like, oh, of course, because, Chris Rufo has these connections with Barry Weiss and, through the Manhattan Institute, all of these like co-sponsored events at Times Square. They both got picked up by the Blaze at the same time. So did Matt Forney. And Matt Forney, I just mentioned, Terror House got picked up, got bought out. So that was his thing.
I haven't heard in a while. Yeah.
I mean, I wish I never heard it in my life. But, it showed that there was like, okay, they picked up Chris Rufo. Chris Rufo said, I want to do it with Lomez. And they asked, all right, who else should we pick up? And they said, Horny Matt Forney. And Horny Matt Forney got dropped because of his tweeting, right? So they picked up John Doyle. So it shows like, yeah, this and it goes back to, what we all observed after October 7th, when we saw all of these vitalists, Bronze Age, whatever, kind of having a knipshit and kvetching about, oh, no, this isn't Bronze Age. You can't use our, You can't use our IP and our branding in this way because, their funders, Peter Thiel, et cetera, Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, they have defense contracts that run through Israel. So that's why, they'll tell you about TND and send them all back, but it's all this kind of kosher racism where it's like they'll call you a low IQ anti-Semite. Well, of course, for them, the natural evolution of their mainstreaming, it makes perfect sense for them to go to Glenn Beck's The Blaze.
I've noticed this in my time working in the quote-unquote right-wing sphere, whether it's like a generic Reagan conservative, so-called populist TM, whatever faction, there's a merchant mindset amongst these people that cuts across like all factions of the American right. And I get the impression as well, especially when you look at it through like a media market lens, that these guys that are soft on the TQ and that engage in this more like acceptable form of transgenderism, they're just creating a little like a more unique niche for themselves, giving themselves like a unique marketing edge to occupy more space and really just crowd out any normal commentator on the right, like any like heterosexual, like normal commentator. Do you get the impression that there's like some type of like grift type of like market dynamic that they're trying to pull with that?
I mean, I tend to avoid the word grift just because I think it imbues it all with a too much morality. Right. And I think that the market in this way is kind of amoral. You're responding to market incentives, you're responding to your funding incentives, you're responding to your audience. And I think that, a lot of people, when they say, oh, why do you call it take selling? It's just grifting. I'm like, grifting implies like there is some sort of, I guess there is a kind of a bit of a more active dishonesty, right? Where it's like, I'm just saying that, the reason why, the whole bit about being media market literate and understanding the take selling market and the media market and whatever is to say, I understand why the whole BAP sphere is going to tell me that criticism of Israel is brown and third worldist, because I understand that their funding comes from contractors whose defense contracts run through Israel, right? That's being media market. So is that a grift? Maybe insofar that they tell you, if they straight up say to your face that it's not. Like, for example, like to take the whole, tranny gate, as we like to call it, that pariah being in man's world, at that time you had people like Zero HP Lovecraft who had been published in Passage Press, and you had people like Captive Dreamer Jeffrey Martin coming out into the timeline to knowingly lie through their teeth and say that, oh, it was actually one of the editors had snuck it in there without anyone knowing. It was a betrayal, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a kind of grift, right? It's an active type of dishonesty. But except for examples like that, I don't think it's necessarily a grift, but I think what you're describing is true, where it's like, it is a type of thing where, it's a kind of new generation of political commentators, media actors, podcasts, whatever, that want to take a kind of edgier tone, right?
Yeah, differentiate yourself. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And start talking about Somalis or whatever, but still holding out this bright red line where it's like, but we're never going to talk about Jewish supremacism. We're never going to talk about Jewish chauvinism. Or the same thing where it's like, we're going to talk about Riley Gaines and, oh, this is unfair and this is not good and blah, blah, blah. But we're not going to talk about the Civil Rights Act. We're not going to say that there is no such thing as a trans woman, that Blair White shouldn't be recognized in law as a female, regardless of whatever, mental health diagnosis he or she might have.
This leads into one point that I wanted to touch upon in this discussion. With regards to the latest, like the Afghan shooter.
It wasn't me.
Yeah.
I just want to get that on the record.
Yeah.
Everyone saw like a fat, pale, kind of like whatever, dark hair. I was like, that is not me.
Yeah. You're in the clear for now.
Yeah, for now, until the FBI starts knocking on my door.
But this is interesting because in these like type of media markets, you see people can be like selectively edgy on like some type of niche issue. Say being like anti-Muslim immigration in the United States. It's a totally different ball game in like compared to Europe, where it's actually like big and it's also more destabilizing. But I've noticed in the US, you can take some very edgy positions on anti-Islam stuff, but there's always like the devil's always in the details. You can do that, but these people are conspicuously silent on, like, say, Indian migration, or even increasingly Nigerian migration as well. Another skill group that is actually surprisingly philo-Semitic too. If you look at recent polling, Indians and Nigerians were some of the few groups on the world stage that actually still viewed Israel in a positive light after October 7th. Do you see that same dynamic in play as well after the shooting in terms of like your analysis of like the take selling since then?
Well, I wasn't aware of the Nigerian thing, but it makes so much sense because they've had this like kind of destabilizing ISIS type of thing, Boko Haram type of thing. Yeah. And it's this type of thing where we see all the time where it's like the anti-Islam rhetoric. It really is. I mean, I don't care about the Nigerian context. I don't care about the Indian context or really even the European context. I really care about the American context, where in the American context, the anti-Islam rhetoric is really just a fig leaf for diverting support back to Israel, right? Because if we convince an American that the biggest threat to him and his livelihood and his family and his security is Islam, then we can very easily transmute that to, well, who's fighting the Muslims? Israel is. That's the whole kind of
strategy of tension.
Right. So, and I mean, just taking like someone like Laura Loomer as an example. Laura Loomer says the craziest shit about Muslims. If I said anything about Jews that approximated what she says about Muslims, I would not have a job. I would be considered like a virulent bigot. But of course, you're allowed to do these things about Muslims because there's no like APAC, JDL, ADL, whatever the fuck it is, for Muslims, because it's such a small, insignificant population in the United States. And other than the migrant class itself, other than the generation of immigrants, their children who go to colleges assimilate very well. They end up being gay, they end up being I'm a perfect example of assimilation,
like our esteemed guest.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, so I think it is what I've noticed really about since the shooting, about the take selling market is like, with the exception of the conversations I've been having, the conversations are incredibly low IQ. The conversations are incredibly not based, but like base and low and unsophisticated. There is this weird thing that I don't quite understand, in that people really don't think of Afghanistan as a real country or Afghans as real people, right? And it's weird because, Iran is not, people don't treat Iran like this. People don't treat Iraq like this. People don't treat Syria like this. None of these other countries that we've had hostilities with get this kind of treatment that Afghans get, where they're a kind of caricature onto themselves, where it's like, it's a nation of like, I don't know what it is, 30 million people, probably maybe more, where it's like, they're treated as though they're all illiterate goat fuckers, and that they're all like, they really, people have internalized this whole like 7th century thing, this backwards thing. This, one of the tweets that Trump retweeted was like, if you showed an Afghan an espresso machine, they chop your head off for doing witchcraft. And I thought it was so ridiculous, because I was like, well, what you're describing is like probably some like peasant in the foothills. Meanwhile, like your educated class, your learned class will tell you with a straight face that men can give birth. So what are we talking about here?
Yeah.
The most illiterate goat fucker in Afghanistan knows which 9-year-old he wants to marry. It's like, so I find it incredibly strange that we have these kind of conversations about Afghanistan, about Afghans. I want to like, at least like, hopefully like when I speak about it on my podcast this weekend, like I want to like have a deep dive into like understanding the last like 40-50 years of how we got here, and kind of treating Afghanistan like an actual country with actual people in it who have actual agency, and that are not just like, the caricature of Osama bin Laden in South Park going Durka Durka over and over again, because that's, I think, what people think. And it's like, so what I've seen a lot is a lot of blame shifting, right? So we have the whole MAGA sphere trying to say this is all because of Biden, right? This is all, he came in during Biden.
Yes, Joe.
Right. And then you see a lot of leftists working he was a CIA asset angle, right? Which is kind of a misunderstanding of what his role was in Afghanistan. And then we have the kind of Laura Loomer sphere of take sellers kind of doing Islam isn't compatible with the West, oh, they're brown, oh, they're low IQ, they're incompatible with the West, whatever. And it's like, whatever, that's all true, but it's like, that's not the point here, right? The point really is twofold. One, it's about immigration, right? We need to be sending people back. Why was this person? But then secondly, it's why was this person brought here? Why is this person here?
Yeah, go into the background of this individual, because if I'm not mistaken, this guy was actually a collaborationist. Yeah, go into the background of this individual and why he was brought here.
And I'm glad that you used the word collaborationist, because I think because we talk so little about Afghanistan and we occupied a country for 20 years and set up a puppet regime and like spent trillions of dollars. I think we don't talk enough about what that was. And the only times we do talk about what that was is like when people like Dan Crenshaw talk about it, and they talk about people like this shooter, the class of people like this, as our allies, these quote unquote translators and allies who helped us during the war. And that's actually the program through which 75 to 100,000 Afghans were brought to America after August of 2021, which, if the audience isn't aware, is when the Taliban liberated the country and the war in Afghanistan ended, or when they formally entered Kabul and liberated Kabul. It was called Operation Allies Welcome. And I think it's important for the audience to understand, it's like, we have to reframe that understanding because it's so deeply flawed, right? You have to think, imagine yourself an American and a foreign nation comes and invades your country. What would you think of the person who jumps at the chance to cooperate with the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or the Saudi, whatever invading force it is, jumps at the chance to collaborate with them, to translate for them, or join some sort of paramilitary force, or join even the official, quote unquote, official military of the puppet regime that they have set up? Right? The Afghan government from 2003 to 2021 was a puppet regime that we set up. So the Afghan armed forces we were offloading our occupation onto them. So, and it's so funny because you see the people the Americans who served, kind of laughing at the lack of training and lack of ability of the Afghan armed forces, where it's like, these are paid. They're only there because you're paying them. They're not there because they're defending liberty and defending democracy, or that they care about these things, right? So to get to the point, the shooter was a collaborationist, like you said. He collaborated with the puppet regime and the forces. But beyond that, he wasn't just a collaborationist in the way that many people were collaborationists, right? They worked for the American University of Afghanistan, or they were a translator, or they had some NGO, or they worked on quote unquote women's rights, or whatever the fuck. Those are all collaborationists too. This guy was a collaborationist in the sense of he was part of a paramilitary force under the auspices of the CIA known as Zero, like the Zero Group or the Zero. Hold on one second. Let me just double check this. I always mess it up. Zero Unit. So I think he was Zero Unit 1. I think there were 3 of these units that were all under the auspices of the CIA. And these are specifically meant for kind of off the books operations. So night raids, black bagging, disappearing, murdering women and children, and all of these things were documented by international organizations where like, these are war crimes. You're killing women and children. But of course, no one looked into it because no one gives a fuck about what's going on there. And, so when the Taliban liberated Afghanistan in August of 2021, we flew close to 100,000 people like this, to America or to resettle them here under the auspices of these being our allies, putting aside the fact that like this person, they were involved in, wet work, basically like completely like black ops. But really it's like what we should be thinking of is like, these are the worst of the worst. In Dante's, conception of hell, these people are in the ninth circle. These are traitors, right? These are people where it's like they're not only are they not refugees, right? Because in August of 2021, when we started bringing these people over here, was the end of the war, right? So you cannot be a refugee after the war ends. Right. The Taliban.
Good point. Yeah.
The Taliban announced a blanket amnesty as they entered Kabul, which at the time, these liberals and, Dan Crenshaw and all these NGOs were like, oh, my God, don't listen to them. They're backwards cave monkeys from the 7th century. They don't know what, they don't know what human rights are. And they're like, we have to bring them because if we keep them there, they're going to all be murdered. All of our allies will be murdered. It's now been almost 5 years, and that blanket amnesty is held, right? So there really is no reason, even if they were refugees, to bring them here, but they're not refugees. And then on top of that, they are these people who are deeply morally flawed because they betrayed their land and their people to work with the foreign occupying army and like to kill their countrymen, to do night raids on their countrymen, to black bag their countrymen.
Are these people, would you say, were they affiliated by any chance with like groups like the Northern Alliance and similar like anti-Taliban forces?
The Northern Alliance kind of speaks more specifically to a specific time period where it's like that early 2000s where we're talking, and so this would be their successors, right?
Yeah.
The successor to the Northern Alliance would be the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Currently, it's the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, right? The Islamic Republic was the puppet regime that we propped up with Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani and all these people. So they are basically their successors, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they are an anti-Taliban force. When there was a Rolling Stone article that I was reading just before this, where they refer to the Taliban, et cetera, as terrorists. But it's like, of course, the Taliban were never the terrorists. The Taliban were the freedom fighters, right? Sure, they engaged in asymmetric warfare. They engaged in, irregular warfare, right? Blowing up jerry cans and IEDs and whatever. Okay, but have you ever seen the movie fucking Red Dawn? If fucking Red Dawn was taking, like, they would be using jerry can explosives. So they were resisting occupation. They were the anti-imperial force. We were the imperialists, and the people that we propped up, like this man and like the Afghan armed forces more broadly and the Afghan government, were tools of, I hate to sound like a leftist, but I don't care because it's just the truth of imperialism, because we wanted to have that access to China's western border and have an eye on Iran and an eye on Pakistan and have Bagram Air Base.
Yeah, it seems like the Afghanistan topic is really complex from like what I've read over the years in passing, and now that conflict's over, it's just like memory hold. But now that when you have like a shooting like this, you'll see just really dumb stuff being propagated on like all sides of the political spectrum. I've heard you say as well, and one of your I've seen you post in one of your tweets the other day that there's a lot of noise being made, but people aren't realizing, like, aren't looking at the bigger picture, that despite all the noise being made, the H-1B visa front still not being addressed. What did you mean by that, like, in terms of like the infinity H-1B visas?
I mean, well, to stick with the Afghanistan thing, right? It's like we're talking about, why was this guy here? We need to send them back. But none of, and now they're even talking about, and it's always a lot of talk, right? And it's always important to remember there's a lot of fucking talk. There's a lot of fucking
perpetual discourse trap.
Right. I'm not seeing a lot of fucking movement. I'm not seeing a lot of legislation. I'm not seeing a lot of, allocation of funds, So, but we're not talking about is the fact that they're like, oh, we're gonna relook at all of these asylum cases. We're gonna reassess all of these SIV cases, these special immigrant visas, and whatever. So long as our government still treats the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban, whatever, the current government of Afghanistan, as a pariah terrorist state and doesn't normalize relations with them, these people that we brought over, whether they're on an SIV or we start treating them as asylees on an asylum basis, will have their asylum granted. Because our law will say that the place that they came from is run by an oppressive terrorist, blah, 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 that doesn't have a legitimate government that we recognize. So we have no way of working with them to send them back, right? So it's a lot of bluster. It's a lot of, just yapping about without actually talking about. And this is the thing. It's like I focus on the law. We live in a nation of laws, despite what people like, how it feels or whatever. We live in a nation of laws. Nothing will change if the laws don't change, right? The interpretation of the laws are only changing the interpretation of the laws are only spurred by changing the judges or changing the black letter of the law.
Yeah, this is like a theme of the second Trump administration, and more so because the first one, there wasn't much done. Actually, if you look at the Migration Policy Institute, they reported that under Trump, despite like all the talk of immigration restriction in his first term, I think he had the third highest number of like total naturalizations of like legal immigrants since 1980. And Migration Policy Institute is like as open borders as it gets, so they don't have any interest of casting Trump in a positive light. But those are just the numbers. But what I've noticed in the second term, it's a lot of theatrics, performative deportations that often times like just descend into like really ghoulish acts of like sadism and stuff like that. And I'm as restrictionist as possible, but you get like a worse of both worlds where they actually radicalize a lot of leftoids, but also demoralize people on the right, because when they start looking at the real numbers, like the deportation numbers and just like the overall admissions of legal migrants, nothing's really being done. And I get the sense that you're just going to see a lot of theater. And I'm actually pretty worried too, especially after the midterms, and it's with the economic situation worsening and this leading to Democrats getting back into the mix. They may end up cutting a deal once Trump is a lame duck, like a big immigration expansion, whether it's like an amnesty or just expanding legal migration. Where do you see things going in the next year or so?
Well, if they do that, good luck to fucking JD Vance. If they do that, it's hail Crockett, hail our people, because that's what's going to happen. But I think you're right, just to touch on what you were talking about, is that what we're getting is a lot of theater, a lot of performance, right? And it's in the worst possible way. We're getting like the Ghibli edits from DHS, and we're getting the ASMR videos from DHS. And it's like, this should be happening at such a scale that you cannot highlight individual cases. But the fact of the matter is, like you said, it's like they're doing this in the most performatively kind of shocking way. Right, not in the most, because it could be much worse. But it's like, you're taking us from a position where we have not only the logical and the ideological high ground. We have the moral high ground too to say we must get these people out of here, right? But the way that they're going about it is to, I think, you could make the argument that it's like purposefully incendiary, so that way they engender this kind of pushback, so that they can throw their hands up and say, well, we tried, but look at how activated they got. They're protesting the ICE and they're beating up the ICE agents and whatever the case may be. So my opinion is, I mean, what are we at? We're at like 300,000 deportations for the year or something like that, something around there, with reported like 1.6 million self-deportations, which is absolutely bullshit. Like, I won't believe that number. If you fucking had a gun to my head, I wouldn't believe that number. But I think we're going to reach a high point at the end of next year, whatever that number is, whether it's 300, 500, 600,000 is going to be the high point of the Trump administration, because then we're going to head into the midterms and the lame duck or a portion of the presidency. So I'm not very hopeful for mass deportations. But you know what we will get? We'll get people who have a vested interest in Vance 2028 telling us that actually we've already deported 40 million. We're actually deporting 100 million. I've been deported. Everyone's been deported. That's what we're going to get. We're going to get a lot of gaslighting.
I'm seeing some articles come out now where they're even saying, and these are not like right-wing, like hard right people, that are saying that the so-called like self-deportation numbers the Trump administration is talking about and like their mouthpieces are talking about are actually just not credible. The numbers just don't add up. And I mean, just look at your average city. It looks like it's above 500,000 people. It still looks like the Mos Eisley Cantina. Let's be real here.
The 4 train still has Guatemalan women with their child strapped to their back on with a blanket sheet, being like, chocolates, chicles, chocolates. That's still there. Where are they at? Where's ICE at? I don't see them. And it should be unceremonious. It should be something where I don't even notice it, but it should be like, I should notice the results.
Yes. One thing that's also dangerous too, and this goes back to your point that you've brought up routinely about the infinity H-1Bs, is that if you look at the original Reagan amnesty, it was passed under the pretext of we're just gonna amnesty these people. We're gonna have like stronger border security, and that never really came to pass. And that's the danger here about when you oppose immigration just exclusively on like illegal lines, is that you open up like the opportunity for your opponents to pull a jiu-jitsu move and say, okay, we'll pay lip service on the illegal immigration front, but we're just going to expand legal immigration instead. We're going to expand H-1B.
Just like you said with with the naturalizations that you mentioned, like with H-1Bs. Yeah, exactly right.
Or create like another category, because there's a whole cornucopia of visas like L1s, all this other stuff that could be expanded. And that's like one of my fears, because I look at like elite discourse and what they're talking about. I mean, you already have people like Matthew Iglesias who has talked about 1 billion Americans, and like the way you're going to reach that, let's be brutally honest, it's just opening up the floodgates at this point. And guess who actually platformed him? In terms of the book discourse, Glenn Beck. There's actually an interview on the Blaze where Iglesias came on there, and that's one of my fears, is that these people are just really myopic, or they're fighting the last war. Because also the one cope they're also turning to is the border crossings, which have actually plummeted. But here, the devil's in the details here. Those border crossings were already plummeting under like Biden's like final months in office that just started. And also,
because they can just fly here.
They're just flying. Yes, exactly. Demographics are changing too. The Latin Americans that are coming in nowadays are mostly like just Central Americans, because across the board from most of Central America to South America, birth rates are plummeting. There's not as many push factors for these migrants to come here. So instead, you're going to get migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, India, like South Asia. And like I mentioned before, and I wrote about this too, that like post October 7th, the most philo-Semitic migrants, well, just people in general, are like Nigerians, Indians, and Kenyans. And a lot of these groups, they're part of like the emerging overclass. You can see this obviously with tech, but also growing up in Texas, there is a large, a pretty sizable Nigerian diaspora that is actually evangelical Christian too. And this is also another point that I want to stress, that pro-Zionism, pro-Israel is actually brown-coded now. It's increasingly brown-coded in the sense that you can go all the way from Guatemala to sub-Saharan Africa, where there's rising evangelical Christianity, and you will find some of like the largest reservoirs of pro-Israel support. Whereas if you go to like Europe or the US, it's actually trending the other way.
Right.
It's trending the opposite way. Yeah.
Well, this is actually why it's really important to, they always decry low IQ anti-Semitism. We also don't want to do low IQ racism, right? Because this is actually an instance in which it would benefit us for us to talk more about, to take a page from Tariq Nasheed's book and talk about foundational Black Americans contra the Nigerians and the Kenyans, right? Because we want the foundational Black Americans are foundational Black Americans, as opposed to this importing this Nigerian overclass over them and using them as like an example of like good Blacks, right? Where it's like, no, we should be like embracing our foundational Black American brothers and sisters contra importing a bunch of Nigerians and Kenyans. Right.
Yeah,
and I think it's really interesting that you brought up Glenn Beck and platforming Matthew Iglesias, because obviously Glenn Beck and the Blaze or whatever, where it's like, okay, Jonathan Kieferman on the Blaze will say it's all about immigration. And then to tie it back to the Afghanistan thing, Glenn Beck in August of 2021 was crying on the Blaze about how we need to import as many Afghans as we can and traffic as many Afghan children out of Afghanistan as we can. Like, very weird, very sick stuff. I don't know what happened to those children. I don't know where they ended up. God help them. I really don't know what happened to them. But Glenn Beck was, along with, platforming Matt Iglesias, was saying, we gotta import as many Afghans as we can. So on the Blaze, you have the fucking shit shovelers like Rufo and Lomez saying, "Oh, it's immigration, it's immigration, it's immigration." Meanwhile, you have the guy cutting their checks saying, "We have to import as many Afghans as possible." Meanwhile, you have Lomez's Manhattan Institute writing policy papers about the positive GDP impact of immigration.
Yes, I'm looking at it now. Beck interviewed Iglesias. This was in late 2020, October 2020. So yeah, it was very near that time frame, more or less. So they were already prepping that discourse. And I've been to panels too, and I would drop by UT Austin when I used to live in Austin, and you would hear people, these like think tank people saying like, "Oh, we need to just loosen legal migration to increase the quota of like the 1.2 to like 1.6 million that they allow legally each year to like 5 million at least." I'm like, damn, like that's where it's heading if things are left like checked. And that's why like people got to look at the bigger picture. I'd also add too, because of the fact we do live in this a Jewish supremacist power configuration, they're going to look for a new striver class, a new managerial class, people that they're gonna trust, and that's why I think it's increasingly gravitating towards these not just like Indians, but also these more pliant global South demographics.
The flatterer class.
Yeah. Yes, sycophants. Yes.
Yeah.
They have very servile behavior. They're hustlers, strivers, and
they're from the Commonwealth. They have they have a historical experience of being subjugated by the British Empire, the Kenyans, the Nigerians, the Indians. So they have this natural flatterer towards the imperial power. I think that has a kind of generational psychological component to it. And the problem is, like you said, it's like people hear the think tank class hears us saying that we have a problem with the illegal migration, but they focus their efforts on the illegal part when we're like, no, the problem is the migration part.
Yeah, the mass migration. Yeah.
Right. It's like, they're like, oh, well, we'll just do it legal. It's like, no, the problem is that they're coming here. I don't care if they have the paperwork. I don't care if they have their T's crossed, their I's dotted. We don't want them here.
Well, this also intersects too with, now there's obviously differences with what we're facing with the UK, but I have one guy I've listened to for years, Mark Collett, who's been deplatformed practically off all respectable outlets. He's actually banned from traveling to the US and a lot of Europe. He's pointed this out too in recent years. Even the political class in the UK after Brexit, they pulled off one of the biggest baits and switches, where instead of importing like Muslims, they're now importing tons of Christians from these former colonies, Kenyans, Nigerians, and all these other groups. And he even has observed this, that in the UK, it's not really turning into a caliphate. It's just like a hodgepodge of different groups beefing with each other now. And that's part of like the strategy of tension of scenario where the elites benefit from the mass migration, not only from like the cheap labor and having just more diversity, but also the conflict that emerges after that. That's just like a justification for some NGO or like new Mandarin position to manage interracial relationships, and also to create a panopticon as well. It's a justification for further mass surveillance.
Right. And it also it takes the indigenous population and it knocks them down a couple rungs on the hierarchy of needs, right? Because now instead of like, a British person exerting their agency outwards towards their government and expecting, concessions from their government, they are now worried about the safety of themselves and their children just walking to school or whatever the case may be. It's like it makes them more insecure and unstable. And it's like, what we end up having there is kind of the same thing that we have here, where it's like their Laura Loomer is Tommy Robinson, where Tommy Robinson's always making a big deal about Islamic migration, but being like, no, not the Indians, not the Indians. The Indians are good. It's like, no, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's the point is that you're creating this kind of destabilizing influx of people.
Well, you also see that too with that Valentina Gomez broad,
right?
Well, she's like she's Colombian, and they're doing this too because MAGA. One thing that MAGA has actually accomplished is created like the so-called, what I like to call the twerking class, like this multiracial class of just slop tier degenerates from all over the planet, not just confined to the US, but also like global South, all these other countries. And they're doing the same old shtick where they get people like in this really hyped up emotional state to like talk smack about Islam, but then in the back door, you just have everybody else coming in, whether it's like a Nigerian, Indian, Kenyan, whatever,
or Valentina herself,
or herself,
talking about Muslims and Sharia. It's like, bitch, you shouldn't be here. You go back to where the fuck you came from, bitch. Like,
I mean, that's the thing too. Because one thing about the second Trump administration, it's not a coincidence why you have like Marco Rubio and them, because the Florida Republican set is very open borders. All your so-called based Cold Warrior, like son of Cold Warriors Cubans, are some of the most like fanatic open border types. Like they are salivating at the prospect of a conflict with Venezuela because it's going to create a massive refugee crisis that those people in Miami want, because they want to turn Miami and the rest of Florida to one gigantic latifundia. That's the game.
Yeah. What's her name? The one who's on The View. What's her name?
Maria Salazar.
No, the other one. The one who's much more. She has like an accent. She's on. Anna Navarro.
Anna Navarro. Yeah.
That's
she's
exactly,
awful. Yeah. That's like, they're the same thing. Navarro and Salazar are like the same, are practically the same person. There's like a very specific Caribbean striver class type of migrant. It's also true as well. The FBAs are correct. Say what you want about Tariq Nasheed. They're kind of correct about the Caribbean types, whether they're Black or Hispanics. There's a very like striver class mindset to them that makes them very susceptible to this type of like slop tier politics.
All of them, even though the Muslims who come here, their daughters go to college and they come.
The hijabis,
the commie hijabis. They come and they become foot soldiers for the left because all of these institutions, like I said, are governed by the Civil Rights Act, right? So they understand that there is a utility in adopting for themselves or their racial identity, their religious identity, whatever, because it helps them more easily navigate the institutions. But how that's often utilized and weaponized is by saber rattling against the country of origin of their parents, right? So you have like these Muslims who their daughters go to college and they advocate for quote unquote human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan, which is really just a mechanism of saber rattling against the Taliban.
Yeah. No, I saw that too during the height of like during certain moments of the Syria crisis, where you would have people like Ilhan Omar who would actually like rail against the Assad government because she's able to kind of play this game where she can sound like a Muslim Brotherhood adjacent person to a certain audience whenever she's attacking Assad, but then sound like a total leftoid to her more American-based audience. It's a multi-vector grift that I see a lot of these migrants use, and I've also seen this too with some of these Hispanics, especially Cubans, where you have like a straight-up European-looking white Cuban that will try to like use the civil rights bureaucracy to get like preferential loans or accuse their employer of like discrimination. It's just like it's a total shit show.
To speak a little bit more about Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib when she was in Congress too, is like what they do is because what they would do is for their audience, their electorate that elected them, right? Whether it's Rashida Tlaib with the Palestinians or in Dearborn or whatever, and Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. What they do is they rile them up a lot with Israel, right? They'll be like, "Oh, we're anti-Israel, we're anti-Zionist, whatever," and it costs them nothing. There's absolutely no stakes in it because the actual party that they're a part of is in complete lockstep with the other party on the question of Israel and defending Israel and supporting Israel and whatever. So they get to kind of have this bratty sub moment where they get to stomp their feet and tell their constituents like, "No, we are doing Islam, we are doing brotherhood and blah, 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 blah." And meanwhile, what they actually do is they push forward like trans and gay and
that's what you get. Yeah. That's the problem too, because coming from a political background like myself, having worked in lobbying where you actually have to get legislative results, I've noticed people put token gestures and words. They value that more than actual legislative like deliverables. That's right. What it should be the inverse. Like if you're actually like a serious political actor, because like just talking like you mentioned with like Tlaib or Omar, pounding your chest about Palestine, that's all fine and dandy, but like what are you doing caucusing with a party that is still very pro-Israel, and the only thing you're getting out of that party at best is like just the LGBT stuff, the transgender stuff, and other nonsense.
And I don't want to absolve our right-wing American white male friends of this too, because what ends up happening is they treat politics, any of this type of like,
it's a transpartisan dynamic in my opinion.
Right, and it makes any of this like kind of ethnic or affinity group constituency electoralism. That's exactly what it turns into. It kind of turns into this kind of quasi, therapeutic, cathartic thing where it's like Trump will tweet out something about how like, DHS and Tim Walz is retarded and these people are coming here and ruining the country and blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, nothing's actually changed.
Yeah,
right? And it's the exact same thing as Ilhan Omar going to her constituency and saying in some disgusting Somali tongue and being like, "We are going to Israel and death to Israel and blah 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 blah." Meanwhile, nothing actually changed in the law. It's like it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, no, that's the shot, and that's as is life in Clown World USA. Well, man, I think this is a good part to wind things down a bit, but before you leave, man, let the audience know where they can follow your work, because you're definitely on a generational run, seems.
A little bit. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter at Basilian Thought. So BASILIAN Thought. I've been doing a podcast with my friend Benny every other weekend. We're going to do another one this Saturday. You can find that. It's The Benny Show featuring Basil on YouTube. But yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll get it all there. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, man. And no, it's a pleasure. You bring some great insights, and I definitely want to bring you back on for sure for future appearances, because you're one of the few people on the left that actually gets like the big picture issues. Anyways, The audience, as always, thank you for tuning in. And with that, El Nino has spoken.